Hi all, welcome back. History of World War II. I'm Norm Fenneman. Today we are looking at the events between the Munich Agreement to Falkeld, which is the invasion of France by the Germans. And we're looking at how that happened and why it was so successful, why it could happen. Okay, a lot of it comes down to diplomacy. We'll also look at strategy. So Hitler is on the move. But first, I want to give you a bottom-up story, a little bit of bottom-up history. I'll introduce you to this young girl living in the Netherlands. Her name is Adriana. She comes from this middle class, perhaps upper middle class family who owned a wasserij, which is a laundry. And she lives in Weesp, which is just outside of Amsterdam. So they're doing linens and clothing for the people of Amsterdam, most of whom did not have a washer in those days, these little apartments in Amsterdam. So she has a very happy life growing up on the river Vecht here with her three brothers, until she is woken up one night by the sound of explosions. And her father comes into the room and tells her that the glow in the sky that she's seen through her window was Schiphol Airport, which is burning because it's being bombed by the German Luftwaffe, much to her horror and surprise. Uh, Soon it gets worse because German soldiers are on her street. And soon after, they're in her house and they're taking the family radio. The family hides the vehicle in a haystack across the way, which is never found during the war, but keeps them nervous the whole time. They're also forcing her father to remove the Dutch flag from the front of the house, and then they arrest her father because his name was on the list, a list of local resistors. So he's in jail, unclear what will happen. And every day, her mom will go to the jail with clean clothes and take away his soiled clothes. And then she would slip small messages on small pieces of paper that are sewed into the hem. Now, for Adriana, her experience of the war is that her town is bombed repeatedly because it was a critical railroad and water junction outside of Amsterdam. Uh, the mayor gets replaced by a Nazi, and for 5 long years she lives in fear while her mother tries to keep things together. Nighttime is listening to BBC on illegal radio, and her brothers are stealing guns from a local German garrison, okay, at the risk of their lives, which is not welcomed by their mother. Now, unknown to her, within a year, all the Jews in her town are rounded up and sent away to a collection camp of Westerbork, and then on to the death camps in Poland. Finally, as suddenly as they came, the Germans left. And this time it's not in trucks and tanks, but they're leaving on foot. And she recalled vividly years later watching them from her front drive as they straggled by, and recalling that she's feeling zero sympathy for them because it really taught her to hate. And though she moved on to Canada to a good life and forgave because she had to, uh, in her 80s, with cognitive decline onset, she was really starts to be triggered again by any German word she might overhear, and didn't have a lot of tact in calling people out on that, saying she had enough of that during the war. Now, till her death at 89, she hung on to the little framed orange stamp, postage stamp, that her mother had hung on the wall during the war as a symbol of the House of Orange, the House of Oranje, the royalty in Holland, which, not incidentally, the Queen of Holland was in Ottawa during the war. The government is in exile in London. The Queen, the royalty, is in Ottawa. Um, and she put that, her mother put that on the war as a form of quiet defiance to the Nazis. Okay? Now, that girl, incidentally, was my mother, and her story is the story of 200 million people that were living and dying in the 30 countries of Nazi-occupied Europe. Many of whom, it must be said, had it far worse than her. Many of whom did not survive. Or if they did, they forever after bore the trauma of imprisonment and torture, or of simply hiding from the roundups of young men who were being sent to work in the factories in Germany. or of watching their parents die or siblings die of hunger because of the intentional Nazi food embargoes which happened when there was resistance. Okay? So, as an answer to that, in the German doctrine, in the Nazi doctrine of collective responsibility. Now, so this is just one story in the tragedy that we're looking at today, and a tragedy that was all due to one dangerously unhinged man, and really the failure to contain him, which, as it turns out, could have been done. So that's where we're going today. Now, to that end, first recall that Hitler did not want war with the West. His plans are for the East, and yet it happens. And unlike World War I, which is 5 years of a near static front in northern France, and the Germans never get to Paris, just to the Paris suburbs and start bombarding it, that's as close as they get. This time they take Holland, Belgium, and France in 6 weeks. Prior to which they've defeated and occupied Czechoslovakia, Poland, Denmark, and Norway. Now, some of that was foreordained in the General Plan East, definitely not the rest. So how did this happen when the Soviets, the Poles, the French, and the British, East and West, were all committed to keeping Hitler contained? There's no really easy answer, but there is one that I'm going to give you in this lecture today, and that is the utter failure of appeasement as diplomacy. Then militarily, how they managed to do that. So that's kind of the why. The how is, as we'll see, the main theory of that blitzkrieg has been questioned. Okay, and the theory is that Germans alone understood modern warfare. Okay? Blitzkrieg, lightning warfare. Everyone else is wedded to these dated ways of fighting, as symbolized by the Maginot Line of France, this useless, as it turns out, a very expensive defense line to keep out the Germans in the East, which you've heard about, I'm sure. Anyway, as with any simplistic theory, the Blitzkrieg theory that this explains everything is really falling apart under the weight of evidence. And that evidence is that the truth is a lot more complicated. In any case, let's look at how it all happens. It all begins with Hitler violating the Treaty of Versailles provisions one by one. First thing he does is he mobilizes an army beyond the limit allowed, the 100,000 limit. Nobody does anything, not the League, not the French, or the English. Then, in a really bold move, he sends his army into the Rhineland. Now remember, this is the region adjacent to France, which for good reason the French had insisted be a demilitarized zone. So this is a test by Hitler. It's a test of how the world is going to respond. And it happens in 1936. He sends in 22,000 troops. And again, no response, nothing happens. Later on, the German general Guderian said that if the French had mobilized, they would have easily stopped the Germans, and that Hitler would have been booted out of office. And in fact, Hitler himself later said that the first 2 days after the remilitarization of the Rhineland were, quote, the most nerve-wracking of my life. He admitted even a moderate resistance would have stopped him. Now, his stated goal in Mein Kampf is to reunify the Germanic peoples of Europe. So that's next. And his first target there is Austria. Okay? Now, recall from what we talked about going back to 1815, Austria has long been the main contending Germanic state of Europe by design. And in 1934, there's a civil war here. And that gives Germany an opportunity to get involved. And it's easy because there's a lot of support in Austria, especially with the young, for federation with Germany. Now, the Austrian chancellor was not in favor, so he ends up being murdered by the Austrian NSDAP, the variant of the Nazi party in Austria, and a pro-German leader takes over. And then when the Wehrmacht invades in 1938, there really is no resistance. Shortly after that, a referendum is held, and the results are 99% in favor of joining Germany. Now, this election is not rigged, but it's also not a secret ballot. The voters are being watched. After that, Hitler starts making noises about the Sudeten region of the new state of Czechoslovakia. Now this area too had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but had never been part of Germany or the old German Empire. But you've got this border region where you have what are called the Sudetendeutsch, the Sudeten Germans, as opposed to the Alpendeutsch, which are the Austrians. There's 3.5 million of them, and it's about a quarter of the population of Czechoslovakia. And like the Austrians, there's a lot of fascists in this area. There's a lot of pro-Germans. They're intrigued with Germany and its evident successes. And already in 1933, the fascist political party here is negotiating a secret pact with the Nazis. Now, the British and French, who are allies with the Czechs, they want one thing, which is stability and peace on the continent. So to prevent a crisis, they managed to pressure the Prime Minister of Czechoslovakia, a man named Edward Benes, to allow substantial self-government for the Sudetendeutsch in order to appease Germany and Hitler and any designs on the Sudetenland. But that's not good enough for the pro-fascists here, and certainly not good enough for Hitler. And he starts demanding that this area be given to him. In fact, he threatens that he will occupy it. Now, Mussolini becomes important here. He doesn't want to get dragged into a war at this point because he is simply not ready for that. So he will convince Hitler to agree to a conference with the Western democracies who have a treaty with the Czechs and are pledged to protect it. So to avoid a potential war, this is what Mussolini does. Hitler is reluctant but agrees. And yeah, what matters is that Czechoslovakia, what matters a lot to the English and French, Czechoslovakia is the last democracy left in all those new Versailles Treaty nations that were created after World War I with Wilson's ideal of autonomy and democracy. In any case, from Mussolini's proposal, what you get is a series of 3 meetings. Okay. The first happens in mid-September 1938. British Prime Minister Chamberlain flies, for the first time in his life incidentally, to Berlin. He meets with Hitler, who at that point agrees to postpone the invasion and to allow for a referendum on self-determination here. That's when Chamberlain comes back to hammer out the details. That's the second trip. When he does, he suddenly faces a new Hitler who changes his tune. And now he demands the Sudeten be handed over in 6 days, and he's demanding unopposed access. Chamberlain is completely shocked by this change, and he argues with Hitler until he finally gets him to agree to make it a few more days. That's the best he can get. So this is now a full-blown crisis. Chamberlain flies home, and now the UK pressures Mussolini to pressure Hitler in turn to convene another wider meeting, this time with the Italians there as well as the French. Now, note that Chamberlain still is not inviting Benes. He's not inviting the Czechs themselves. Okay. So, in any case, meantime, the UK sends an emissary to tell Hitler that invasion will mean war with England. Now, he does not believe that. But in any case, we get the famous Munich Third Meeting. Okay. And this meeting is one in which, to prevent war, France and England agree to give up the Sudeten region on the promise that this is it, okay? That Hitler is to make no more territorial claims. There would be no more land grabs. Now, since then, of course, this has been widely seen as this massive failure in diplomacy, most associated with that famous image of Chamberlain flying home in September 1938 saying peace in our time, while he's waving this piece of paper with Hitler's worthless signature on it. So quite simply, the Czechs now must stand down while German tanks roll in across the border. Meantime, Hitler gives a piece of his prize to Hungary. And why does he do that? He wants to gain Hungary as an ally, mainly. So this is a complete disaster, and it's made absolutely clear when later Hitler invades the rest of Czechoslovakia, which, you know, key point is the first time he proves beyond any doubt that he is a simple imperialist. This does not fit with his rationale of unifying Germans. Okay, that is a key point. These are not ethnic Germans. They are not celebrating the arrival of the Panzer divisions, right? So Munich then is a massive fail, okay, in short. But key point here, most people in England were thrilled that Chamberlain had kept them from war. Not everyone, and certainly not Churchill. Great quote by Churchill on this. He says, Chamberlain was given a choice between war and dishonor. He has chosen dishonor and will have war anyway. Completely accurate. Now, my point to you today is not just that Churchill was right, but that the Munich Agreement, which the Czechs called the Munich Dictate, was really the disaster that caused World War II. That in fact, it might not have happened, not gone beyond this point, had this agreement not been hammered out. Now, I'll give you 4 reasons for that, and first you might want to think about what those reasons might be. But the first thing is that what Chamberlain did and what the French did really emboldened Hitler, and it made him really believe that the Allies had no backbone. And of course, that encourages him to do more. And that is what is called the Munich lesson, right? Which is that you can never appease a tyrant because they will interpret restraint as weakness. And this, of course, only encourages them to escalate their demands. Right? Now, there's a lot been written on the Munich lesson, and it's certainly very influential in the post-war decades during the Cold War, and it still is today. It was what the Kennedys were thinking of when they refused to allow missiles in Cuba, and it's used in more recent times to explain why the world has to stand against Putin, right? Like Hitler, he denied having any designs on Ukraine until he invaded, right? Before that, he'd already taken on Transnistria region from Moldova. Before that, a big chunk of Georgia, right? So parallels are made, but it's always difficult to know when to apply them. The Munich lesson. Great quote there from Churchill again on what happened here, and the Munich lesson is that each one hopes that if he feeds the crocodile enough, the crocodile will eat him last. All of them hope that the storm will pass before their turn. So the lesson: stand up to a tyrant. The second point I want to make to you is that the Wehrmacht is not, and notwithstanding all the propaganda of how strong they are not ready for this invasion. They are not nearly as strong as Nazi propaganda suggested. And German generals know that they wouldn't be able to take this fortified mountain region, which, by the way, is designed by geography to be perfect for defending, and which the Czechs had done a very good job of. And in fact, I recommend you watch the movie Munich, The Edge of War. That came out in 2022. If you do, you'll get a much deeper sense of this time period. And you'll know, if you've seen it already, you'll know what I'm going to say next, which is that Hitler's chief of Supreme High Command of the Wehrmacht was in fact plotting a coup against Hitler at this time. Now, this is General Halder. He is Oberkommando of the army. And he figured the invasion would be a disaster. So he's planning to remove and assassinate Hitler the day that the order comes down for tanks to cross the border. Now, high-ranking men in the Wehrmacht intel branch are in on this, and the intelligence branch is called the Abwehr. And the head of the Abwehr is an anti-Nazi named Canaris. And his deputy, Hans Oster, is the main organizer of the plan. This is why it's called the Oster conspiracy. Now, of course, though, it doesn't happen because Hitler doesn't have to use his army because the Sudeten region is given to him, so the plot falls apart. Okay. Third point about why Munich was such a disaster that caused the war is that most Germans were not in favor of a war. And we know this because the Abwehr knew it. Nazi intel is obsessive about public opinion on the home front, and that's directly because of the lessons of World War I, where things fell apart on the home front and ended the war for the Germans. So, which is the perception anyway, and partly true. The SD also is the information branch of the SS, completely separate, and it also has polled Germans, and it knows this too. So Germans would not have been enthusiastic about this. Had Hitler had a fight on his hands here, if he'd survived the Oster plot, he'd still have a time of it. Okay? But instead of facing a long and bloody battle, the Germans end up being relieved and impressed with Hitler that he got what he wanted without a fight. Okay, so next point. Think about what country hasn't yet been mentioned here, and that is the Soviets. And Munich is a disaster because of this lost opportunity with Stalin. Okay? Now, the Soviets probably, and the Poles definitely, would have defended the Czechs had Hitler gone into the Sudeten without an agreement. Now Poland, because they're worried about their own skin, and the Soviets because they had a mutual assistance pact with Czechoslovakia. And in fact, Chamberlain knew that, but instead of using it as an advantage, it's the reason he did not invite Stalin to the negotiations, which was not a good idea. He thought it would be better that he appease Hitler than have this heroic standoff. So real lost opportunity here to stand united. In fact, what we get is the opposite. Appeasement allows Hitler to divide his enemies, and this is probably the biggest reason that Munich is a failure, is the effect that it has on Stalin. And that's because Munich is the point where Stalin decides it's in his best interest to get a deal with Hitler rather than the UK. From his perspective, which is that of a paranoid dictator, he is not invited to the agreement, one, and that's suspicious. Secondly, he's seen the English and the French throw an ally under the bus. He wants to defend himself in case of war. So rather than the UK, negotiations begin between the Soviets and the Germans. And within a year, the two foreign ministers sign what's the famous non-aggression pact. Okay? Von Ribbentrop signing for Germany, Molotov for the USSR. Possibly the most cynical and doomed treaty in history, given that fascists are completely committed to destroy communism. That's what animates them, and vice versa. Okay? So the world is completely stunned when it is announced that this pact has happened. What the West and others don't know at this point, they'll find out 1 week later, is when the Germans invade Poland, the Soviets do as well. Okay, Germans in the West, Soviets in the East. So that's when it's discovered that this is more than just a non-aggression pact. It's also a deal to divvy up Eastern Europe, basically to roll back the frontiers to where they've been before World War I, before Versailles. Okay, with the Soviets taking back the Baltics, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Eastern Poland. So it's the old Romanov territory. Hitler taking Western Poland, the old Second Reich. So, in any case, France and the UK declare war immediately, much to Hitler's surprise, and they calculated that they would, or sorry, Hitler calculated that they would keep surrendering their allies because this had been the pattern. So now he's in the wrong war. Now, recall he respected the English, and he respected them for the wrong reasons. He respected them for keeping the inferior races of the world suppressed for so long. And racially, he feels more of a connection with the Anglo-Saxons, definitely, than he does with the Slavs. So Hitler gets the wrong war, but in any case, it's a disaster all around. And it's all based really on a misconception among the English leadership that Hitler was rational and would make rational choices. And you get this paradox where the more they pursued appeasement, reconciliation with him, the more they created the conditions in which that would be impossible. Now, as to Chamberlain, his days in office are numbered, given what happens, but he stood by his decisions till the end, which for him was not long in coming because he dies in November 1940. Unfortunately, after seeing Hitler take France and after the Battle of Britain, which nearly sees the UK defeated, which one could argue was largely because of him. Counterpoint to that argument, and that's a good one for armchair quarterbacks, that historians. Counterpoint is that he did what was necessary in context, in a context in which delay was imperative, because the UK was nowhere near ready for war in 1938, so he bought them time. That's the counter argument. Now, as to Poland, you may know it's a complete rout, even though the Poles put up a heroic effort. Okay, they suffer 900,000 casualties to 60,000 Germans. They lost 6,000 planes to 1,000, and then they lost 5,000 tanks to 600. Okay, so brutal. And this is on the German front alone. recall that they're also fighting Russians in the east. Now, what's not known till much later is that prior to the invasion, with the help of the German-Polish minority, the Germans had compiled a list of people to liquidate when they invaded Poland. There were over 60,000 names on that list, and this is politicians, academics, priests. It's anyone in leadership roles. This is called the Intelligenzen Pommern, the intelligentsia of Poland. And the Gestapo organizes these killings immediately. It also involved SS action groups, so we get hundreds of mass executions, over 700, and they are brutal. Now, it helps to understand that German soldiers are preconditioned. They're conditioned by this prior to the invasion, this pre-invasion propaganda of Polish atrocities against Poland's German population. They really believe this. So they believe it is tit for tat. It's a settlement of scores. Now, all told, 6 million Poles would be killed before the war is over. Yeah, which is the highest number proportionally of any occupied country. Meantime, Western Poles get evicted from their homes and they get resettled in the East in this Germanization campaign. They get resettled into what's called the general government area. And so that's a process that we now call ethnic cleansing. And then soon after that, the SS would turn to a bigger task, which was the systematic murdering of the Jews with mobile killing units in Poland, beginning in Poland and then extending into the Soviet Union as they invade there in the Baltics. Now this is massive. Over 3 million Jews in Poland when the Germans invade, many of whom had recently fled Germany. So very tragic. Now, after Poland, we get what's called the phony war, where both sides are preparing for inevitable war in the West. And during that time, though, it's not completely quiet. The Russians attack Finland, and they take the eastern part of that country, the border territories of Finland. The Finnish army holds them off, and the Soviets incur major losses and end up signing a treaty. That's an important signal to Hitler that the Soviets are not as strong as many think. Then, after that, the British suffer this embarrassing loss when the Germans take Norway. They did that partly by invading Denmark, which they erased very quickly, and then gaining access through Sweden, which remains neutral, so that, or it allows access through their country in order to maintain their neutrality. Not very heroic, but mainly how the Germans take Norway is this amphibious attack on the coast, which is a combined naval, amphibious, and airborne assault. And what they're doing is they're utilizing warships to transport troops directly into key coastal ports like Narvik, which is super important because of its coal deposits and iron ore. Now, to do that, they sailed right past the British naval base at Scapa Flow, there off the northern coast of Scotland. Now the British know that the Germans are sailing by, but they assume that they're simply breaking into out to the North Sea, not to hit Norway. Now, though the English managed to retake Narvik, they never managed to dislodge Hitler from Norway. It's very difficult to dislodge anyone by way of an amphibious invasion, and that becomes a footnote in the war, because after the fall of France, or with the Battle of France, those troops are withdrawn anyway. So Norway is a complete disaster, and because it means that the Germans are now well cited for their war on England. And it's such a fiasco that it led directly to the defeat of both the French and the British governments. This is when Churchill becomes prime minister of an emergency government. It's nonpartisan. It's an all-party coalition. He is appointed. Okay? He's never elected. Okay? He's the only of the one of the wartime leaders that was not elected by the constituents. In any case, that is May 9, 1940. And then the very next day, it happens in context of the famous Norway debate. Next day, May 10, Germans launch their attack on France. Now, this attack is called Plan Yellow or Fall Gelb, And what's amazing is, in spite of all the preparation of the Maginot Line and 400,000 British Expeditionary Force soldiers in France to add complement to the French army in defense of France, the Germans managed to take Paris in 6 weeks, as I said before. And the British evacuate the continent, and many French do, famously from Dunkirk. Churchill also famously chimes in here and he says, "War is not won by retreats." He's great for the pithy, timely quote. Okay, so why does this happen? How does this happen? And that's been debated ever since. There's a massive historiography. I'm not going to have the complete answers for you here, but let's look at that. And one thing is the Allies knew the German plans ahead of time, the initial plans, which were like the Schlieffen Plan of World War I, other than it involved Holland, which is to sweep from the north, from Belgium, in this case Holland, first, and that would be the main assault into France. But a couple months prior, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein convinces Hitler on this bold plan, this alternative, whereby the main thrust will be through the Ardennes forest in the south, just north of the Maginot Line, the French defenses there. And it's seen as an impenetrable region for tanks, forested and hilly. Now, Hitler loves high-risk gambles, and so Army Group A under von Rundstedt's command is put on it. Now, remember that name because he's later famous for actions in the East. So 7 Panzer divisions are placed here, unbeknownst to the Allies, and what we get is this initial battle at a place called Sedan, but the French are quickly overrun in their what is now their divided and indecisive army, and the Germans sweep all the way to the coast. They're going so fast that they're filling up at French petrol stations. And this is under the famous Erwin Rommel and Heinz Guderian. They're leading this charge. And they're operating independently, really, under something that had not been planned ahead of time. That's an important point we'll get back to. But in any case, Erwin Rommel and Guderian will later be in charge of defending the Atlantic Wall, the coast of France, from the incipient invasion from Britain. In any case, they chase the Allies to that famous pocket around Dunkirk. And the escape there really is a miracle, the miracle of Dunkirk, because Hitler orders his panzer divisions to stand pat and not close the circle, which gave the British a precious 9 days that they needed to evacuate 85% of their men. Now, why did Hitler do that? Well, a couple reasons. It's reported this is mainly boggy terrain. It's not good for tanks, so why waste them here? Especially given that his air commander, Goering, has promised that he will annihilate the Allies from the skies anyway. Then, though, the weather changes in favor of the Allies to a low ceiling, so the Luftwaffe cannot get airborne, and Goering cannot deliver on his promise. Not the first time, not the last time he'll fail there. And in fact, the conditions are perfect weather-wise. Misty weather, also calm seas. So you get this 9-day window where, as I said, 85% managed to get out. But yeah, the British propaganda spins it as a big victory, the miracle of Dunkirk and the little ships. In fact, most men go back in large naval ships. There is some volunteer participation here from England, but not a lot. And the British are desperate to seize on anything that looks positive in what's really a major disaster. After this, the French government is now divided on what to do next, and the options are to flee the country and potentially fight on from the colonies, which are very proximate to France, that's North Africa, or stay and accept defeat and look at what terms the Germans will give. In that context, the Prime Minister resigns, and a man by the name of Pétain, and he's an old World War I hero, he takes over. And by old, I really mean it. He's 84 years old. Okay, so he immediately suspends the Constitution of the French Republic, and then he signs a deal with the Germans. And it's in order to really save France from complete occupation. And the deal is that the French his government can continue to exist and self-govern southern France from the city of Vichy, France. And Pétain and many in the French government believe that this is a solution, but in fact this government becomes the leader becomes more and more of a puppet over time. They really lose their independence until finally they lose it entirely when the Germans will invade southern France in the context of what happens in the battle over Africa. We'll look at that later. Meantime, the loyalists in France flee the country, and that's under General Charles de Gaulle. He is chased out of France with his army as the Germans direct their attack south, right? And as they take control of the coastline, which they will hang on to. Now, it needs to be said that Petain's regime is initially popular with a lot of French for keeping the Nazis out, at least partially, and for saving France from that World War I type of destruction, that yard-by-yard fighting that saw so many French killed and so much of French territory ruined. Also, they're popular because they are dealing with the left wing, which is the French communists, right? And France is a very divided nation between communists, between left and right. Now that popularity wanes as his French forces, Petain's French forces, are put in a situation where they are fighting the French resistance on behalf of the Germans. And they're doing that with their special police force, the milice. Meanwhile, the British are repeatedly asking the French leaders in this context of this battle and the loss to the Germans to send their navy, which is not in German hands, to send that safely to Britain or to the West Indies. And this is a massive navy at the time, right, which will be a huge asset for the Germans when they seize it. So they don't want it falling into German hands and are encouraging the French to sail to Britain, if not that, the West Indies. And this navy has already sailed to Oran, okay, this French city in North Africa, in Algeria, out of hands, away from the Germans. But the French admiral here, his name is Francois Darlan, he'll come up later again, he's too proud. He refuses to surrender his navy. And so Churchill makes one of the most consequential, incredible, brutal, and controversial decisions of the war, and that is to attack the French fleet at its base, okay, in order that the Germans cannot acquire it. And he manages to sink 6 big battleships. They're taken out. In that move, 1,300 French navvies are killed. Okay, 1,300 French sailors. Now, clearly, this is major. This is really bad for Franco-British trust going forward, which is, is historically tenuous anyway. And it becomes really great ammunition for the Germans and the Vichy regime in their propaganda and their pretense that England is the real enemy, not Germany. But it also sends a message, that's what Churchill is doing, that England is all in, is seriously in the fight, is not going down with the fight, and will make those difficult decisions. And part of that is Churchill's message to the Americans that, we're in it for the long term, and we are a worthy ally. Now, the standard view is that the French are outclassed, outdone by being wedded to defensive warfare, which had been rendered obsolete, right? Defensive warfare, the Maginot Line being the great symbol, rendered obsolete by blitzkrieg, which the Germans apparently invented and perfected. Now, blitzkrieg, just to be clear, in short, that relies on mechanized divisions, which means motorized. Further to that, what happens is first the Air Force destroys or gains aerial superiority by destroying the enemy planes, comms, and supply routes on the other side, on the defensive side. And then it punches a hole in the enemy defenses. That's a spearhead at just one point, the weakest point. Now the infantry follow, but not on foot as in old warfare, World War I, but they follow in fast trucks, In best case, these fast columns then peel off and encircle the defending army and trap them. Okay. Now, the image here is from a 1943 U.S. Army training film that explained it best, and you can find it online. These episodes or this series is called Why We Fight. It's 6 or 7 episodes, and it's fascinating stuff. It's done by the famous director Frank Capra, and it's done for the U.S. Army as it gets into the war. Now, okay, so now there's a few problems with this whole monocausal interpretation I just gave you, and I'll go through a few of those. And the first is that, well, the French command actually does expect and plan a defensive line in the Ardennes region. So it's not like they're completely ignorant to the fact that this might happen. Okay, so that had been in the plan, a defensive line here. And they also do try to establish one there in the context when the Germans come in, okay, and or when when they invade through the Ardennes, they just happen to lose it. The second problem with the old simplistic interpretation is that it's the British, not the Germans, who invent blitzkrieg strategy. Okay, and a credit for that can go to John Fuller, who was head of the tank division, a British head of the tank division in World War I. And specifically at Amiens, the Battle of Amiens in 1918, he becomes a British hero because this is a critical watershed battle that he wins using tanks. Okay, now post-war, when every European nation has this military academy that's studying the lessons of World War I, he writes this book called Plan 1919, where he describes what he calls breakthrough warfare, which really is blitzkrieg warfare. Now, so he really is the first. In Germany, there's a guy named von Seeckt who comes up with something very similar in 1928. So you can read back and look at his and say, yeah, this is where the Germans are at. But there's no evidence that he's won many over. In fact, he's very old school and controversial because he wants to bring dueling back to the German army and all these other things. But yeah, looking selectively at documents, one can think it's the Germans, but it's the British who really are onto this strategy first. So no evidence that guys like von Seeckt in Germany have won many people over, and or the wider military academy in Germany. And in fact, it seems they have not, because Germans are showing the same commitment as the French to defensive war prior to World War II. And this is something that's seldom raised. And you see that most clearly in the Siegfried Line. Okay, now this is a defensive line that is 400 miles long. It has 17,000 bunkers. There are pillboxes. There's dragon's teeth. And what matters is this is a massive investment that it could have gone into many U-boats or tanks. Okay, much steel, a lot of steel is used in this and reinforcing rods in the concrete. And in fact, more to the point, this is eating up 9% of the military budget in 1938 and 1939, whereas the Maginot Line at that point is taking between 1 and 3% of the French military budget. There's a lot more going on as well. And there's the fact that in the one tank-to-tank battle in 1940, the French handily beat the Germans. And this happens in Belgium in a place called Gembloux Gap. Look it up. Not often talked about. It's a major victory for the French. And here, 2 panzer divisions are destroyed. Thousands are killed in action on both sides. But the Germans especially, and in one of their divisions, they lose an astounding 670 men out of 700. The Germans essentially panicked, and their attack here was stalled in the north. And unfortunately, though, this ends up being a moot point because the main thrust, as you know, is in the south. Right? There's also the fact, though, that the French are more mechanized. Okay? This is also not talked about much. The French have more tanks than the Germans, and they're better tanks. The Panzer II is what's mainly used by the Germans in the invasion of France. It's not adequate defense because armor-piercing shells go right through it, as we saw at Gembloux Gap. Now, another point is that what goes down as this amazing example of blitzkrieg in action, I've said this already, is opportunism. But the point there is that the Germans are taking a huge gamble in exposing their flanks in that long thrust across northern France. And had there been a counteroffensive, they would have been stopped, an effective one. The problem for the French is they keep showing up in places they're not supposed to be, and the French are completely flummoxed and confused by it. But yeah, again, in that thrust, Rommel and Guderian are operating outside their orders, which some say is a German way of warfare going back to the 1700s. Bewegungskrieg, which is mobile warfare. Okay, and this is when men in the field are taking advantage of a situation and enjoy a lot of operational independence compared with the typical army. If you want to know more about that, read Robert Citino, The German Way of War. In any case, this is not called for in the invasion plans, this big thrust, but it's enough to panic the French and get them burning their archives and evacuating their headquarters. And that's a segue to the fact that a lot of this is not German brilliance, but mistakes on the part of the Allies. Okay, and for one, again, there is a failure to regroup here, to shift strategy to a new defensive line after the breakthrough in Sedan. And partly that's because the Allies, the French especially, would not contemplate leaving the infantry in Belgium to their fate to capture by the Germans because they cannot retreat. Okay? So to make that new defensive line in the south would lead them to their fate in the north. Also, the failure here had as much to do with other factors and the French allies. Okay? The Dutch and Belgians, their neutrality till the last minute is not helpful. And also the thin commitment of the English in terms of manpower. Okay, the British Expeditionary Force was too small in 1940 to do much for continental defense. It consisted of only about 10 divisions, about 390,000 men total by the time of the campaign. And that's compared to the massive French and German armies. Now, this reflected Britain's historic reliance on a small professional army and a large navy. Another side of that is that the British kept much of their Royal Air Force in reserve in England, fearing the Battle of France would be followed by the Battle of Britain, and they would need that to defend their islands. So, yeah. And during the battle, fighter squadrons based in France pulled back to England or ceased operations as France collapsed. Again, needed to defend Britain. That's the British perspective. The French also lose it really in terms of communications. They have a lovely headquarters outside of Paris in this Louis something hunting palace, but it has only allegedly 2 phones, apparently. And it's impossible for commanders in the field to know the situation. Plus, really key here, almost none of their tanks had radios. Okay? This is the most basic requirement for battlefield coordination. And the German tanks do have radios. And yes, there is a morale problem that does lead to defeatism. The French have seen this movie. They don't want to pay for the sequel. Okay, basically, that's it. Plus, their main plan was for a different war in the north, and there really was no plan B. No plan B to anticipate a German attack. So even if you make a heroic effort to shift your defenses mid-battle, as they did, it's really ad hoc at best. And when you don't have a plan B, morale breaks down pretty fast. And then finally, France is very divided between right wing and left, and that is mirrored in the Army Command, which is civilian Army Command. And here, political loyalty mattered as much as competence and experience in appointments, which is never good. And you see the problems here when the Supreme Commander, General Gamelin, is replaced mid-Battle of the Ardennes. In fact, at a critical moment in the breakthrough. And because of that, you get this bonus 2-day window for the Germans as the replacement general, Weygand, he first cancels and then he reinstates a counteroffensive. Now, finally, the last thing I want to talk about is what almost everyone forgets in this story, and that is that the French were not just waiting for the Germans to attack. Okay, in fact, they had made the first move, and that was right after war was declared. This was a full 8 months before Fall Gelb. At this point, the French invaded Germany. Right at the beginning of the war in September, and they make it to within 1 mile of the Siegfried line, so it is very successful. But then they retreat. After the fall of Poland, they go back to the Maginot Line. Okay, so why was this? Why did they retreat when they were doing so well? Well, one thing is really poor intel on the side of the French, and in the sense that they overestimated German power. What they don't know is they have a 3-to-1 manpower advantage. They also don't appreciate that 90% of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, is in Poland, and while they're making their thrust. And they're also, a third point is they're unprepared. They only have partially mobilized their army at this point. But yeah, mainly they fear a rout by the Germans. But here's General Jodl at the end of the war saying, in essence, that the French could have taken them out quite easily. You know, maybe, maybe not. But a key takeaway from this is that French military strategy was not static in 1939. And also, if you think about it, it is not static in 1940, because in 1940 they defend in the east their right flank, or they try to, and they did attack in the west by advancing into Belgium. But in any case, none of this works, and that's the gist of what Marc Bloch called the strange defeat. A famous French Jewish historian, Marc Bloch, who joined the resistance after the fall of France, and then gets executed right near the end of the war with 700 others. Now, this strange defeat is the first book of many that try to explain this disaster. And it's a disaster which, in the end, we give Churchill the role again for summarizing what happened. He famously said, you know, what General Weygand called the Battle of France is over. I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin, right? And upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. You always put it in those terms, that we have the lights of perverted science, which is accurate for Germany for sure, racial pseudoscience against preserving Christian civilization with those values of individualism and liberty and freedom as he sees it. Upon it depends our own British life and the long continuity of our institutions and empire. The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us. And then Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. Okay, and that's where we're about to go. Of course, he's right. Hitler plans to take England next. And so, yeah, so that's today's lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for listening. And always, if you have questions, 100%, let me know if you want to talk about it. There's points that you take issue with. I'd love to hear about it. All right, cheers. Thanks for listening.